Thank you very much, and thank you everyone, because I think one of the great things that's happened in this pre-summit is we've been able to understand more about each of the other action tracks, and finance is so closely interconnected with all of the other action tracks, because if you're serious about equity and inclusion, it costs more. If you want equitable, inclusive, gender-responsive education, first you need to factor in how you're going to finance that. It's a massively important issue. And one of the things we pick up in our discussion paper on finance is that when households are charged for access to education, it should be seen as an indicator of a failing public system, as a regressively financed system, because when you pass the costs on to parents, it is one of the least equitable ways of financing education, and it leads to a stratified system. So if we want to maximize the power of education as an equalizing force in society, we need to make sure we have equally accessible education systems that are not stratified and where access to education is not based on your ability to pay. And that means shifting the financing to fair, progressive taxation. And that's something which is right at the heart of our finance paper, recognizing that the core finance for education comes from progressive tax systems, and there's so much more that we can do in terms of expanding tax systems in a progressive and gender-responsive way, in line with the guidance from the International Monetary Fund that most countries could expand their tax to GDP ratios by 5 percentage points, doubling spending on education, doubling spending on health, and doubling spending on social protection. So if we want to have equitable education systems, we need equitably financed education systems, and those connections are really powerful and really strong. I think also if we look at Action Track 2 and we're looking at the importance of taking seriously lifelong learning and transforming education systems to be responsible for sustainable development, then I think we need to be recognizing that that's a whole new level of ambition. When we're looking at the impact of the climate crisis and the importance of education to help build a new citizenship, an active global citizenship, we also need to look at how we can play a role and draw on the climate finance, which is increasingly becoming important worldwide. We've already flagged in relation to teachers the profound importance of having long-term predictable financing, and particularly to look at some of these strategic policies that impact on the financing of teachers, perhaps most notably public sector wage bill constraints. When overall constraints are placed on the public sector wage bill, teachers are the first to suffer because they're the largest single group. So we need more teachers and we need better paid teachers. We need to address that absolutely and systemically. And in terms of building a revolution in the digitalization of education, that really, and if we want to move towards open source teaching learning materials, there's really significant impacts in terms of financing. So we have this action, the discussion paper from our action track. We had a session here yesterday, which we had very positive reception from, and we're hoping to get a lot more feedback from everyone. The big shift that we're calling for is to recognize the big picture of education finance, that 97% of the financing is from domestic sources, and let's get serious about what needs to be done to maximize what we can do with that 97%, and that does need action on tax, action on debt, when countries are spending more on debt servicing than they are on education or on health. It means action to push back against austerity policies when particularly they include public sector wage bill constraints that impact unintentionally maybe on teachers, but they do have a serious impact. We need to look at these big systemic issues, and we need to shift the mindsets and the timeframes within which people are conceiving the financing of education. We've had incredibly positive response to this overall steer. There's a lot more work that we need to do. And I think in the coming weeks, one of the things we really want to push is a direct dialogue with the International Monetary Fund, because we look around the room here and we say, who's here and who's not here? Well, ministers of finance on the whole are not here, and the International Monetary Fund are not here. And yet the policies of the International Monetary Fund and the understandings of education of ministries of finance are the things which we really need to shift. We need to shift the mindset to see education as investment, not consumption, and we need to shift the policies and guidance that frame the dialogue between the IMF and Ministries of Finance. So we're going to make a direct reach out to Kristalina Georgieva, the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, and really deepen a dialogue with the hope that they will come to the summit in New York and make serious commitments to change some of the practices at country level. We believe there's an open door there, and hopefully that will really help to resolve some of the difficulties that ministries of education have in dialogue with ministries of finance. There's a lot more work which we also need to do to really build this global compact on the financing of education. So if countries are shifting their own domestic financing for education and making new commitments to education, this needs to be matched by international commitments, both international action to take to resolve some of the obstacles, but also let's match that commitment of 15% of 15 to 20% of national budgets being spent on education with a clear commitment that 15 to 20% of aid and concessional loans will also go to education. That's the basis of an equitable compact, and that should be absolutely central to the way in which we frame a transformative agenda for New York. Really looking forward to the huge amount of work that needs to be done in the coming weeks, and really need to be collectively holding to account some of the actors who are perhaps not here in the room at the moment, but we really need to engage with in the coming weeks.